Bonjour, bienvenue sur cette chaîne, Thomas le pasteur, où j'ai le plaisir d'avoir avec moi aujourd'hui un interview. Et puis j'ai un orateur de qualité qui a accepté de participer à cette interview. Donc voilà, n'hésitez pas à mettre votre prénom et l'endroit d'où vous venez dans le chat, comme ça on fait un petit peu connaissance. Voilà, moi je suis Thomas, je suis d'Île-de-France, et puis dans un instant je vais présenter mon invité, mais vous pouvez tout simplement déjà faire un petit coucou dans le chat. Ce que vous pouvez faire aussi, c'est inscrire vos questions dans le chat, alors soit en français, soit en anglais directement. Si c'est en français, je les traduirai pour notre orateur du jour qui est anglophone. Et donc, c'est une première pour moi de faire un interview en anglais. Donc, j'espère que vous serez aussi indulgents avec moi. Donc voilà, je vous laisse encore le temps de vous présenter dans le chat si vous voulez. Et puis, si vous pensez que cette vidéo peut intéresser quelqu'un, n'hésitez pas à partager cette vidéo sur vos réseaux, sur WhatsApp, voilà, sur ce que vous voulez pour faire connaître cette vidéo. Alors, je redis un petit mot. Donc, moi, je m'appelle Thomas, je suis l'animateur de la chaîne YouTube Thomas le Pasteur. Et le but de cette chaîne est de surmonter certains obstacles que l'on peut avoir par rapport à la foi chrétienne. Et aujourd'hui, c'est une première, j'ai avec moi un intervenant qui parle anglais parce qu'il habite à Oxford. Il est philosophe, il est professeur de philosophie à l'université d'Oxford et il nous fait vraiment l'honneur d'être avec nous aujourd'hui. Donc, l'interview sera en anglais, c'est une première, mais vous pouvez poser vos questions dans le chat soit en anglais, soit en français. Je ferai de mon mieux pour les traduire. Et puis, si c'est difficile pour vous de comprendre l'anglais, vous pouvez utiliser les sous-titres et la traduction automatique. Alors, je ne sais pas si ça fonctionne en live, mais en tout cas, en replay, vous pourrez utiliser les sous-titres et la traduction automatique, voilà, qui vaut ce qu'elle vaut, qui est approximative, mais qui peut aider. Voilà, voilà, donc n'hésitez pas à faire un petit coucou dans le chat. Je vois qu'il y a Isabelle qui nous dit bonjour de Colmar. Eh bien, nous te saluons aussi, Isabelle. Et voilà, donc sans plus tarder, je vais introduire donc mon invité du jour. Donc, comme vous pouvez le lire à l'écran, il s'appelle Max Baker-Hytch. Il est donc titulaire d'un doctorat de philosophie de l'université d'Oxford. Il a fait ensuite des recherches post-doc et aujourd'hui, il est enseignant aussi à l'université d'Oxford dans le département philosophie, bien entendu. Donc, je vais lui donner la parole et lui demander de se présenter pour commencer. So, very welcome, Max. We are very glad to have you with us. Maybe my first question is, can you introduce yourself?
Yes, well, thank you very much, Thomas, for having me. And it's really good to be with you and with everyone that's joined to watch this live stream. I am a my official title is tutorial fellow, which just means lecturer in philosophy at Wycliffe Hall at Oxford University. And I have been in that job for, I think, 7 years now. And before that, I a couple of what are known as postdoctoral research fellowships. Those are kind of first rungs on the academic job there, I suppose. And so one of those was at Oxford University. One of those was at the University of Notre Dame. I'm sorry to the butchering of the pronunciation of your beautiful cathedral in Paris, but Notre Dame is an American university, and that's how the Americans pronounce it. But University of Notre Dame has a really good philosophy department, and it actually is strong in philosophy of religion. So I worked there for a year. And I did my doctorate in philosophy at Oxford University. I suppose I am mainly interested in terms of my academic research and my writing in questions about the rationality of religious belief, the nature of evidence, and the arguments, the sort of philosophical arguments about God's existence. And I'm interested in questions to do with what essentially kind of the fact of disagreement, diverse opinions and disagreement about topics, religious topics, and what the kind of rational significance of disagreement is. Does awareness of other people who've thought about things, you know, and who seem to be conscientious but have an opposite to should that kind of lead you to lessen your confidence, for example? So I'm very interested in all of those sort of questions. Yeah, it's a real pleasure to be with you today. And yeah, I do like taking opportunities to do podcasts and YouTube interviews and that kind of thing, because I do think it's important for academics to relate their work to a wider audience where the opportunity arises.
Okay, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to have you. Thank you for your answer. I have another question. So you are also a Christian. When and why did you become a Christian?
Yes, thank you. Well, yes, I would say I had a Christian upbringing. So I would go to church with my family when I was a child, and we would go to Sunday school. And yeah, I think I did sort of take that seriously till about the age of 12 or 13. But then I think as a teenager, I gradually lost interest in Christianity. I didn't necessarily become an atheist. I just was apathetic, really, and just really didn't give very much thought to issues to do with the existence of God and so on. But actually, by the time I was kind of 17 or 18, I wasn't just apathetic. I actively thought Christianity was bad. I thought it was sort of restrictive and kind of repressive, and that also it was sort of a force for a force for ill in the world. And so, but I should say, even then, I wouldn't say I was an atheist. I was probably agnostic about the issue of God's existence, but I was probably still. I would entertain the idea that there might be some kind of afterlife, perhaps. But really, when that shifted was when I went to university as an undergraduate to study philosophy at Exeter University. And really, I would say there were two things that, prompted me to have a second look at Christianity, I suppose. So one was encountering a group of people in my halls of residence who were Christians, and who I thought exemplified a kind of a sort of depth of friendships that I didn't quite see elsewhere. There seemed to be a real authenticity about the community, the depth of the friendships, and that was quite attractive. And then at the same time as that, I was, as I said, I was studying philosophy, and I was getting interested in thinking about these big metaphysical questions. And I became aware that, you know, there have been a number of very influential philosophers in the last 100 years and up to the present day who are serious Christians, but have had a respected and kind of significant body of work in philosophy. People like Richard Swinburne, Alvin Plantinga, and so on. And so I guess I started to look at the intellectual case for Christianity, both in terms of philosophical arguments for the existence of God, as well as historical evidence pertaining to the life of Jesus of Nazareth. Over a process of several months, I came to think that actually, on balance, Christianity offered an account of reality that seemed to me to make the most sense of things.
Mm-hmm. Very, very interesting. Thank you very much. Could you say that when you became a Christian, it was a one-time event, or maybe you take some months or
Mm.
years to put your trust in Jesus Christ? Can you explain us?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think inevitably there are kind of milestones, but I would see it as having been a gradual process that took place over the course, maybe, I don't know, 4 or 5 months. But yeah, certainly I think that it would be fair to say there were milestones when I, for example, a particular occasion when I prayed, and almost as a kind of agnostic experiment. And yeah, it seemed like I had some kind of quite compelling religious experience in response to that prayer. And I would say that that probably was a kind of one sort of milestone on that journey. Another one would be a moment where I remember thinking about, you know, the fact that we live in a world that's full of pain and suffering and so on. And I remember having the thought that actually the only kind of God that I could sort of entertain really was a God who had in this world and experienced suffering and pain firsthand.
Hmm.
And of course, you know, Christianity, I think it's fair to say, uniquely among the world religions, claims that God did indeed kind of step down and you know, become incarnate and take on human flesh. And so yeah, that I would see that as having been another milestone. But so I hope that kind of answers the question.
Mhm. Yes, yes, thank you very much. Another question, were your philosophy studies a plus or a
Mm.
minus on your journey to faith?
Well, that's a very good question, and a commonly asked question. I think many Christians have carry a kind of wariness towards philosophy, and maybe an assumption that philosophy is inherently hostile to Christian belief or religious belief more generally. And in one sense, I can see why. So there, some of my undergraduate lecturers in philosophy certainly, you know, would just kind of very casually say things like, well, of course, that we all know there are no good arguments for God's existence, or, you know, well, some people even think there's no evidence at all for the existence of God. And you know, that I even remember one teacher, one lecturer for, I think, for the formal logic kind of class, would set problems that would you know, make reference to things like the ontological argument, which is a kind of famous argument for God's existence that originally was formulated by Saint Anselm, that kind of tries to argue for God's existence from first principle. Anyway, it's an interesting argument. There's been lots of debate about it, but I just remember this particular problem sheet this professor set was phrased in terms of explain why the ontological argument is ridiculous. So it was very much that kind of very confident, dismissive tone. But what I also then realized was that as is often, it's often the case that those philosophy professors who are very dismissive and talk as if, you know, debates about God's existence were settled at the end of you know, maybe the 18th century, or you know, with figures like David Hume, or perhaps the early 20th century with Bertrand Russell, and that really there's nothing more to say on it. You know, God is dead. The arguments are no good. But those kinds of professors, in my experience, at least at the university where I did my undergraduate, it turned out that they don't generally work in that area of philosophy. That's where they're publishing. And so in a sense, they're not really kind of speaking out of a deep familiarity with the current state of play in philosophy of religion, which is the branch of philosophy that actually studies the arguments for and against God's existence. And then, I became aware of the fact that actually some of the, arguably some of the top philosophers in terms of the impact of their contributions to the profession in the 20th century, were theists, were believers in God. So, for example, Saul Kripke, I mentioned already, Alvin Plantinga, Richard Swinburne, Peter Geach, actually, Elizabeth Anscombe, and I could list a number of other names. But, all that to say, actually, I have tended to think that my philosophy studies have been a plus in terms of my engagement with Christianity, and it's never seemed to me that there has been any kind of inherent conflict between the two. And actually, it was through my studies as an undergraduate in philosophy that I really I just developed this kind of thirst for asking these sorts of fundamental questions about reality. And it seemed to me, and still seems to me, that theism, and specifically Christian theism, is able to offer the most compelling answers. And I should say as well, it's not the case that all of my undergraduate professors were hostile to Christianity. A couple of my professors who were Christians and who I found kind of very inspiring, and I've continued to find that, and actually that at Oxford, I would say I've never really encountered that sense of dismissiveness. Of course, many Oxford philosophers are not believers in God, but then again, if a significant number are, and I've mentioned Richard Swinburne, but also Brian Leftow, who was my doctoral supervisor. Robert Adams spent some time at Oxford, so did his wife Marilyn McCord Adams, so all that to say, I think that because there have been very significant figures who's, even if you don't agree with their work, I think you'd have to agree that it's rigorous and it's serious scholarship. And so for that reason, at Oxford, I've never really encountered that kind of dismissiveness.
Okay, thank you very much. So, according to you, what are the best arguments for the existence of God, and can you explain them?
Yes, thank you. Well, I think the first thing I'd want to say that I don't think any single argument for the existence of God sort of has to carry all the weight of kind of making the case for God's existence. It's very common these days to think in terms of what's a cumulative case. So a cumulative case is where you have a number of arguments, each of which has some force, but which on its own may not kind of be completely decisive. But when you combine them, it turns out that you have quite a compelling reason to accept a particular conclusion. And I think this way of thinking about arguments works best when you think of arguments as raising the probability of a particular conclusion. So I'm quite a fan of a kind of probabilistic way of thinking about arguments for the existence of God. Because deductive arguments for the existence of God, for example, where you say, just to take an example, what's known as the Kalam cosmological argument, which I think is an interesting argument, but it says that, well, everything that begins to exist has a cause outside of itself for its existence. The universe did begin to exist, therefore it has a cause outside of itself. Now, the thing with that is that if one of the premises is false, then the argument fails altogether. But with a probabilistic argument, such as the fine-tuning argument is very, very often framed as a probabilistic argument, then you can think in terms of degrees of strength of the argument, rather than a kind of all or nothing. And so yeah, that's how I like to think about arguments for the existence of God. I think they're best framed in terms of probabilities. So what would be some of the things that feature in the cumulative case that I would that I would see as making a compelling reason to believe in theism? Well, so I've mentioned fine tuning. So in a nutshell, physics in the last kind of few decades has discovered that a number of the fundamental constants and quantities have to have values within a very narrow range out of all the values that they could have had. For example, the strength of the gravitational constant has to have a very particular value, and it seems like it could have had other values than the value it does have. And so if the strength of the gravitational constant has varied by, I think it's estimated to be as little as one part in 10 to the power 53, so very tiny kind of room for maneuver there, the universe wouldn't have been able to contain galaxies, stars, and planets. And there's many other examples of fine-tuned features of the universe. And so yeah, the idea is that this finding is much more what you would expect on the hypothesis of intentional agency, rather than the hypothesis of there being no intentional agency behind the universe. Another argument that I think is kind of underappreciated, and another family of arguments, are arguments from consciousness. So arguments from consciousness begin with some observations about the very kind of unusual phenomena of consciousness, the unusual and you could say very weird phenomenon of consciousness. So a number of philosophers who are not theists, as far as I know, have made, I think, a strong case for thinking that first-person experience, or what sometimes philosophers sometimes call qualia, first-person experiences are qualitatively different from physical properties. Even if it's true that every single conscious experience we have is correlated with a brain event, it still seems as though conscious experience isn't a physical property. And there have been a number of arguments that have been given for this in the literature, and that I could go into if you want. But in any case, the thought with an argument for God's existence from consciousness is that the existence of this phenomenon of first-person experience is something that, whilst it's not logically incompatible with atheism or specifically naturalism, it seems to more at home in a theistic universe, a universe in which mind is at the foundation of reality. So those are a couple of examples. If you're interested, so I've given a whole overview of basically contemporary arguments for the existence of God in a chapter in a book that's coming out with Cambridge University Press soon. It's called the book is called the Cambridge Handbook of Religious Epistemology, and the chapter in it's the first chapter which I wrote, called Natural Theology and Religious Belief, where I give an overview of 8 different families of arguments for the existence of God.
Very interesting. Thank you very much. I have an additional question. So you said that you prefer talking about probability of the existence of God. Does that mean that we cannot be sure that God exists?
Depends what you mean by we can't be sure. I mean, if well, so yeah, if I'll pose that question back to you briefly, Thomas. Do you mean kind of having 100% certainty that God exists?
Yes, it's my question. Can we have 100% sure that God exists?
Yeah, so I think, yeah, it's a very fair and natural question to ask. So I think I would want to make a distinction between two kinds of commitment, if you like. So on the one hand, you've got sort of your level of intellectual confidence in the truth of a claim or a proposition. And yes, it is correct to say that on my preferred probabilistic approach to epistemology and specifically the question of God's existence, yes, you don't have to have 100% certainty. Now that, it seems to me, is compatible with being 100% committed existentially to Christianity as a framework in which I live my life. And so I think, you know, you could compare this to, I mean, this a crude analogy might be with marriage. Okay, so you know, you on the one hand, you kind of have a sort of emotional feeling toward your spouse, and that can sort of waver up and down in different seasons. At sometimes you might feel really kind of outpouring of emotions, of warm feelings, and other times it might be a bit harder. But that, I think, is compatible with 100% commitment to your spouse, to take actions that put them first, and so on. That makes sense. So that's kind of, that's a very crude analogy for the way in which I think about religious faith. And so yeah, I think you can 100% committed to Christianity whilst your level of intellectual confidence in the truth of Christianity, and specifically God's existence, isn't necessarily, well, it isn't going to be 100%, and it might fall below, you know, it could even fall quite low, and yet that you still have that commitment.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you. We talk about philosophy, and sometimes with philosophy, you can conclude to the existence of God. So my question is, how can you know that the philosopher's God, or the God of philosopher, excuse me, is the God of the Bible? In fact, is he the God of the Bible?
Yeah, that's a great question. Yes, and famously, some people in the kind of Christian theological tradition have said that they're not the same. So Blaise Pascal, a figure you probably are well acquainted with, once famously said, you know, he had this religious experience, and he said, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob is not the God of the something to that effect. I can sort of sometimes see where people are coming from when they say that, but I think the way I would prefer to think of it is in terms of an analogy that the philosopher Eleanor Stump has given, which I find quite helpful. So Stump argues that God is well, sorry, not an analogy, rather a model for thinking about God. So Stump argues that God is both a kind of a particular person, or as philosophers sometimes say, a concrete particular, as contrasted with an abstract thing like, you know, the number 2 or redness, a quality that you know, the quality of redness is what's known as a universal. It's not a particular thing, right? Contrasted with this cup is a concrete particular, right? It's just it's one particular thing. In this case, is here in space and time. So what Stump wants to say is that God is both an abstract universal and a concrete particular. And so I think that philosophy, and particularly analytic philosophy, which is the kind of philosophy that, as you may know, is fairly dominant, at least in the Anglophone world. Analytic philosophy, which you know, very much kind of puts a lot of emphasis on logical analysis of arguments, sometimes using formal logic, you know, probability theory, that kind of thing. I think that the way in which philosophers can access aspects of God is real, but I think what they're accessing is that kind of abstract, universal aspect to God's being, whereas there's also, as Stump suggests, God is also concrete, particular. God is personal, and to access persons, to have knowledge of persons, it's not sufficient just to kind of reason our way through arguments and so on. We actually have to have narrative and even direct acquaintance with that person, and so that's why we can't know God, or at least we can't know God in a remotely kind of full sense, apart from the kind of narratives that we get in the Bible. So that would be a rough and ready way of thinking about how they are both kinds of discourse, that is, and philosophy, or perhaps specifically analytic philosophy, and narrative. And I'm thinking in particular of the biblical narratives, of thinking that they are both talking about the same being.
Thank you. But can we be sure that the abstract and the concrete one are the same? Another question is, did you see maybe some contradiction between the God of the philosophers and the God of the Bible? Are we sure it's the same one?
Well, I think the Bible, I think the first thing we have to remember is that the biblical authors were not writing a philosophical treatise. They were, I would say, in testimony to their encounters with the living God. And that reaches its apex in the encounter with the incarnate God in the person of Jesus of Nazareth. And so the biblical authors do sometimes allude to divine attributes like God's power, knowledge, being present in all places and times, knowing the future. But and you could start getting into a thing of sort of trying to line these up with kinds of divine attributes that philosophers will typically think that God would have to have in order to count as God. I think one needs to be very careful about doing that, again, because biblical authors weren't trying to give a philosophical treatise. I do think, insofar as the biblical authors do talk about God's nature in a sort of somewhat philosophical sense, I think it's clear that they think, God is well, I mean, St. Anselm talks about God as being the greatest conceivable being. When I look at the biblical texts and the things that the psalmist said about, and I ask myself the question: would they be able to resonate with Anselm's idea that greatest conceivable being? And it seems to me that they would. They want to say, God is worthy of our praise because he is greatest being in reality. He knows the end from the beginning, etc., etc. So yeah, I think they are kind of gesturing towards the kinds of things that later philosophers are going to want to spell in detail and attempt to spell out in very logically precise ways. The other thing to say is that, there's kind of approach to thinking about God's nature, which is called perfect being theology, that some people argue comes from Anselm, or perhaps it goes even further back than Anselm. But in any case, Anselm quite specifically articulates this way of trying to figure out what attributes God would have, where he basically says, well, take a particular attribute like being all powerful, and ask yourself the question: would it be greater for a being to have this property or lack it? And if the answer is yes, it would be greater, then you think that it has that property. Now, of course, when we try and do that sort of exercise, we're inevitably drawing on intuitions about value, right? And Brian Leftow, who, as I mentioned, was my doctoral supervisor, he has made the point that our intuitions about value, which we draw upon when doing this perfect being theology, are if we find ourselves in the Judeo-Christian tradition, those intuitions have been shaped by the Bible. So there's a sense in which it's not like a separate thing from trying to encounter God through the biblical narratives. The two things go together, I would suggest.
Mhm. Okay, thank you very much. Now is the time for question and answer. Thank you very much for this interview. Donc pour les personnes qui nous suivent, c'est le moment de poser vos questions. N'hésitez pas à les poser donc dans le chat, hein, sous la vidéo pour qu'on puisse répondre. Donc certains ont commencé à nous saluer dans le chat. En fait, pas beaucoup de monde, mais voilà. Donc si vous avez des questions, allez-y. C'est le moment de profiter de la présence de notre orateur. Voilà, je vois pas beaucoup de questions qui arrivent pour le moment. Alors je vais essayer de commencer. Allez-y, hein, n'hésitez pas à poser les questions. So I will start with my own question. In your testimony, you said that at one point of your life, you thought Christianity was bad, or maybe against freedom, or I don't know. And I think a lot of people are thinking that what make you change your mind about this question?
Yeah, that's a good question. Well, I mean, I think it's really comes down to the person of Jesus, and I think here I want to say that I think I would quite readily acknowledge that there are forms that Christianity has taken that are harmful, and sadly, there's sort of a kind of epidemic of scandals of famous Christian leaders that's happening in the last few years, and it does seem to be symptomatic of something deeply unhealthy in a certain form of Christianity. And so, yeah, I in one sense, I'm not kind of completely disagreeing with my past self who thought that. And at the same time, I think what makes me kind of look at the situation in a slightly different light is that, yeah, when I kind of read the Gospels and look at the person of Jesus and look at the really kind of countercultural ways Jesus just kind of embraces people on the margins of society, especially the way Jesus treats women. This is really significant, I think, and it has to be said that Christianity has historically and today it's time, quite confining and oppressive for women. But again, the thing that makes me kind of take a second look is again the person of Jesus, and just look at the way that, for example, in chapter 4 of John's Gospel, Jesus meets this Samaritan woman in the heat of the day at the well. And, one thing for a Jewish man to talk to a Samaritan in general was really kind of scandalous. They were supposed to be mortal enemies. And for Jesus to talk to a woman on his own was additionally kind of really scandalous. And just he kind of so sort of caringly kind of has this conversation with her where he shows deep interest in her life, and really kind of wants her good. And and then there's many other episodes like this in the Gospels as well, where it just seems to me that actually Jesus often kind of I think that people who find themselves kind of frustrated with religious hypocrisy, and with the ways in which kind of religion can oppress people and can bind them and take away their freedom. I often want to say that actually Jesus would be kind of standing with you and would basically kind of be agreeing with your concerns. So yeah, I think that's how I would begin to think about that.
Mm-hmm. Yes, thank you very much. We don't have a lot of live comments now. So maybe can you suggest us a few books to go further in the
Yeah,
reflection of the existence of God, or about
I'd
the
be happy to.
relevance of Christianity? I don't know if you can write directly them, or maybe you can.
Yeah, I
Um,
think I can do that. I tell yes. So I'll well, maybe I tell you what. I'll write them in the chat, and then I'll just briefly explain
okay.
a little
Mm-hmm.
bit about each of them. Okay, so
For example,
the
you
first.
told us about the book where you wrote the first chapter,
Okay, yep,
for example. Mm-hmm.
sure.
Okay. So okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. I can post them. Okay.
Okay. So
Okay.
yeah, there's
Thank
a
you.
few to get going.
Okay. Thank you.
So shall I
Donc
say? Oh, sorry.
non, sorry, excuse me. Donc, je poste, selon la recommandation de Greg Jean, des idées de livres. Donc, et puis donc là, donc notre ami Max va les présenter rapidement. So, yes, can you just introduce the books? Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so the one you just mentioned, Thomas, the Cambridge Handbook of Religious Epistemology. So that's a pretty heavy kind of tome. It's an academic book, but it is somewhat introductory. And yes, as I mentioned earlier, I wrote the first chapter of that book, which gives an overview of contemporary arguments for the existence of God. But there are I think there are something like 15 chapters in that, maybe even 20. And there are essays on a range of topics to do with, for example, rationality of believing in miracles, the significance of religious disagreement, that kind of thing. So that's a resource, and not all of the authors are Christians or theists. Some of them are, but some of them are not. I've also recommended Richard Swinburne's book, Is There a God?, which is his slightly more popular level version of his book, The Existence of God, where he builds a kind of probabilistic case for the existence of God. Then there's, moving to more specifically sort of historical evidence. Peter J. Williams' book, Can We Trust the Gospels?, I think is a really excellent presentation of some of the really compelling lines of evidence, thinking that the Gospels are faithful eyewitness accounts of the life of Jesus. And also another book that I think is excellent, that also does a good job of presenting a number of different kinds of lines of evidence, whether that's archaeology, extra biblical sources, or various kind of internal markers of authenticity. Lydia McGrew's book, Testaments to the Truth.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much. I just post also the link to the book of Swinburne translated in French. So if
Good.
okay.
Yeah.
I am not sure the other are translated, but this one I have this book, so I just put the
Okay, good.
in French. Okay, thank you very much. Maybe peut-être que les personnes qui nous écoutent ont des questions aussi à poser, donc vous pouvez les poser en anglais, ou sinon vous pouvez aussi les poser en français et puis, soit je les traduirai, soit j'utiliserai, des outils, comme Google Traduction ou comme ça pour les rendre compréhensibles, à notre orateur. Donc n'hésitez pas, même si vous avez une question en français, vous pouvez la poster en français et puis j'essaierai de la traduire au mieux. Okay, thank you very much. I just said to the audience that they can post question in French, and I can try to translate them into English.
Mhm.
So I don't see more question coming. So I say a very great thank you to you, Max. It
Yeah.
was
Well, thank you for having me.
a pleasure to have you. Thank you for
Mhm.
the suggestion of readings. And I wish you to have a great success in your works, in your academic teaching too. And thank you for
Well, thank you very
helping us
much.
to think about the question of the existence of God.
No, you're very welcome, and yeah, thank you again for having me.
Um, I can see just one question arrive.
Okay.
It's written on the screen too.
Mm,
How would you recommend helping someone struggling with doubt? I know people who work in the scientific field, and to some people that in that field, God obviously isn't real. I will just
mm,
translate for the French people, French-speaking people. Donc,
sure.
Greg Jean nous pose la question. Donc, comment aider des personnes qui combattent, qui sont en lutte avec le doute? Voilà, ça c'est une
Mm,
première question et puis la personne complète en disant: «Donc je connais des gens qui travaillent dans le domaine scientifique et pour eux, dans ce domaine, ben, c'est une évidence que Dieu n'est pas réel». Donc voilà la question et puis maintenant je passe la parole à Max pour la réponse.
mm.
OK.
I think, yeah, there's so much to say about the topic of doubt, and yes, and I think many many kind of people who think deeply about these questions, if they do find themselves with Christian faith, do struggle with doubt at various times, and I would include myself in that. I think I'll just say here two things really. So one thing is, I think, it is important to appreciate the force of objections to Christianity, but I think sometimes there's a sort of over what's the way to put this? A friend of mine puts it in terms of kind of disconfirmation bias. There's such a fear that we will be biased towards Christianity that we almost put exclusive focus on the objections and the evidence against. And I think it is important to appreciate the force of the evidence for Christianity. And a way into kind of studying that would be to read the sorts of books that I just recommended, and I've really found that when I've looked into the historical kind of the historical material around Jesus, that there's just this robustness there in terms of the way that it seems to these multiple perspectives that seem to kind of mutually support one another, and as I said, that the two books I recommended will document these various lines of evidence that all come together to point to the conclusion that these were that there's really no other way to make sense of these documents other than as having been written by people who are close to the facts. And so I think making yourself familiar with those lines of evidence is going to be important. But secondly, I think an understanding of what faith is going to be important here. So I think there is a model of faith that is quite popular among Christians where faith and doubt are basically contradictory states. You can't have faith if you have doubt, and I think that's unhelpful and also mistaken. way of thinking about what faith is. So I would just go to what I said earlier in response to your question about probabilities and certainty. So as I said, I think that faith consists in at least kind of two elements. One is the sort of level of intellectual confidence, which, as I suggested, I think quite naturally, can go up and down a bit. And then on the other hand, there's this sort of existential commitment to Christianity that I think can stay kind of a solid commitment despite intellectual confidence sometimes wavering. And I actually think that the long discussion in Hebrews 11 about the nature of faith, we'll see the way that the different kind of exemplars of faith are talked about. So Abraham, for example, he's commended for his faith. It seems to me that, well, the way in which Abraham did something that was commendable was that he intellectually he didn't have certainty about where he was going to be, where he was going to end up when he was called to leave his hometown of Ur. But he did so nonetheless. He kind of acted in a way that expressed his commitment, despite, I'm sure he did have intellectual, this was a good idea, but nonetheless, he acted in a way that expressed commitment. And so yeah, I would suggest that those two things, kind of making yourself more familiar with the positive evidence for Christianity, and also kind of having an understanding, a more nuanced understanding perhaps of what faith is.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And in the second part of this question, it was about people working in the scientific field, and for them, obviously, God isn't real. What can you say about that?
Yeah, it's hard to comment really without knowing the details of that really a bit more. Yeah, I suppose, like, I would just say in general, I think, so in Western culture, science is often pitted against religious belief. But I think actually, and I talked about fine tuning earlier, fine tuning is something that this sort of atheistic take on things wouldn't have predicted, 100 years ago, wouldn't have predicted the discovery of the fine-tuned features of the universe. And so, yeah, I think I would just want to kind of really scrutinize this idea, which is certainly put forward very commonly in our culture, that science is just kind of obviously making God an unnecessary explanation and so on. But yeah, I guess I just don't think that view holds up on scrutiny.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Thank you so much, Max. So I really appreciate this time. Thank you very much for helping us to think about more about the existence of God. Maybe the last question just appear now. So I will read it in French and try to translate. Bonjour. Où voit-on dans le monde qu'il y a une morale objective alors que les hommes de toute époque ont eu une morale différente selon les cultures et les époques? Donc c'était question en lien avec l'argument sur la morale de Dieu. Voilà, donc je vais essayer de traduire. Donc, excusez-moi. So the question is, is there objective moral? Because we can see that men in different ages have some different moral values. So what can you say about this? It's about the question of the moral argument. What can you say?
Yeah, yeah, that's good. I mean, I mentioned the moral argument, and I think there are people who I think respectable sort of articulation of the moral argument for the existence of God. I personally haven't tended to put so much weight on that. Now, I think it's worth saying actually that in the field of moral philosophy, a survey was done which suggested that kind of a majority of contemporary moral philosophers think that morality is objective, and probably almost certainly the majority of those moral philosophers who think that morality is objective are not theists. So I think that's just worth kind of noting. It doesn't sort of prove anything, but it's interesting. So yeah, I think that the questioner is sort of raising an objection, which is a kind of classical objection to moral objectivism, and the objection is roughly that I suppose that if there were objective moral truths, then wouldn't we expect everyone around the world in all times and places, broadly speaking, to agree on what those moral truths are?
Mm-hmm.
And so yeah, I suppose like I can see where that objection is coming from. One thing is that it can be called into question the extent to which there radical divergences between the moral sort of outlook of different cultures. I mean, C.S. Lewis wrote this book called The Abolition of Man, in which he attempted to map out what he saw as the kind of common set of moral intuitions that you could find in more or less all human cultures, and so he thought that there was a strong kind of common core to morality, which was cross-cultural, or around which there was a cross-cultural agreement. And so I think one way to look at this is in terms of that there are deep agreements about moral principles and more surface level disagreements about the application of moral principles. So for example, I mean, slavery, human slavery, thankfully is condemned in most cultures today, but we know that that wasn't always the case. And the thing that's striking is that in cultures that have in some forms practiced human slavery, it's typically been the case that they have seen slaves as less than fully human. And famously some of the framers of the U.S. Constitution said that African Americans were 3/5 of a human being. And it seems to me that the reason they said that was that they saw clearly this universal principle that human beings have some kind of rights that shouldn't be violated in a way that slavery egregiously violates them. And so then, in order to try and justify the practice of slavery, the only thing open to them is to try and claim that the individuals they're enslaving are not fully human. And so, yes, I think that's an example of the way in which there is this kind of fairly widespread, I would suggest, set of moral intuitions about these principles, such as that human beings have some kind of dignity that can't be taken away from them. At the same time, that there's a disagreement about how those moral principles are applied or to whom they apply. So yeah, I think that those would be the beginnings of an answer to that.
Okay, yes, thank you very much. Very interesting. So I think we can conclude now, and I really want to thank you again, Dr. Baker-Hytch. Donc, je disais que nous allons maintenant conclure. Voilà, ça fait une petite heure que nous sommes ensemble. Merci aussi à vous d'avoir posé vos questions. J'espère que cette vidéo vous aura donné envie de creuser encore la question. En tout cas, voilà, si vous trouvez de l'aide dans cette petite chaîne YouTube Thomas le Pasteur, eh bien, tant mieux, ce sera le but. Donc n'hésitez pas aussi à vous abonner à la chaîne pour être tenu informé des prochains événements. En tout cas, voilà, je vous souhaite une agréable soirée ensoleillée. Si c'est comme chez moi, là, j'ai vraiment très chaud ici. Et donc, je vous souhaite une très bonne soirée. So, Dr. Baker-Hytch, I want to thank you again and wish you a pleasant evening and maybe a next time.
Absolutely. Yeah. Well, thank you for having me on, Thomas. And I hope you have a pleasant evening too and a really nice weekend. And the same to all of your viewers.
Okay, thank you so much. So goodbye.